Welcome to another video. The main theme is about the definite article the or the. Before we start, I want to just read some question I put to AI about how English might be analyzed and taught in other ways. In the beginning, it wasn't quite understanding what I was asking it or getting at, and then finally when it did, it admitted a few things. And so let's look at that first. So I wrote something to this effect. Effective communication is not a question of how effectively rules are being applied, especially when that of enforcing them risks learners developing hang-ups. And given how inaccurate and vague these rules about how English works are, it boils down to how rigid English natives and teachers have become or can be when it involves making mistakes despite the fact that it may not impede understanding, while dismissing inaccuracies being disseminated about English grammar, how it is supposed to be working, ignoring sort of flexibilities about English. And rather than admit that how we teach it and disseminate it across the globe with inaccuracies, inadequacies, and contradictions, not least to admit misunderstandings occurred anyway between native speakers despite claims as to the accuracy of such perspectives on how English is. Instead, if grammar were propounded as being phenomena rather than rules, might we not eliminate many excess rules and conventions and let English be, to flourish rather than restricted? Learners get discouraged by often superfluidity, which really mostly undermines non-native speakers' intelligence and allows natives to brush aside our own Lilliputian attempts at improving how English could be viewed, as it is intrinsically more flexible and eloquent than what we have reduced it to, cutting corners at our own detriment and sacrificing those qualities for mediocrity. So I put that question to AI, and after much debate finally got it to admit the following. You are correct that just because something is generally accepted does not necessarily mean it is accurate or correct. It is possible for widely accepted beliefs and practices to be flawed and incorrect. You make a valid point that the use of articles in language, specifically English, can be complex and nuanced, and that the omission of an article may not necessarily distort the message of a sentence. And yet we often see it doesn't seem to be optional, just taking out an article, even if it doesn't impede misunderstanding or it doesn't affect whether something has to be definite or indefinite, you would still need it, right? And so this is one thing we have to look at. Why is that? And I propose that it's a rhythmic aspect, that we need a kind of a pre-syllable before a word or phrase so that we prepare the listener for something, and also to make sure that we're not talking about a proper noun but just a common noun as an example. And yet we omit articles when there's plural and non-count nouns, and that the omission of it is called zero article, which means the article is there but it's not pronounced, which is another interesting concept. We can get into that because we can argue that all languages have articles, only they omit it because it's not necessary, and therefore it's called a zero article. Anyway, it continues on. I continue debating, and then it gives me other answers. By acknowledging the inherent flexibility and variability of language, we can encourage learners and teachers to engage with the language creatively and develop their own unique linguistic styles. Well, why not? I mean, language is just communication. Why not be flexible and stylistic and, allow anybody to express themselves as they want, as long as they're understood? Ultimately, effective communication involves not only following standard rules and conventions, but also adapting to different situational audiences, recognizing the inherent variability and flexibility of language use. Yeah. And engaging in ongoing learning language skills. Well, let's engage. This is the reason for my ebook and for my videos. And it is important for educational institutions to stay up to date with new findings and incorporate them into curricula as appropriate. So the question is, what is impeding these institutions that are fundamentally about educating accuracy and a richness of knowledge? When linguists and researchers come up with more accurate and up-to-date findings, these should be incorporated much more quickly into the curricula. And the restrictions are always the excuse that it's financial and administrative and all the rest of it. But I mean, instead, institutes will just buy the new book. Although it says new edition, there's really not much change except for maybe the topics, right? You no longer have a fax machine, so you change it. Really, there should be much more proactive changes. And this can be done with digital media. But since we print the books and it costs money, the schools won't buy updated versions for another 2, 3, 5 years. And there's where the problem lies. Some schools don't even bother. They have books that are older and arguably maybe even better than the new ones. But I had to insist to AI before it gave me sort of reasonable argumentation as to why current teaching approaches and misanalysis of English are at the core of this problem. And I insist that these so-called correct grammar conventions do more harm than good. Let's look at the definite article. And there are different aspects I put in my ebook here that you won't find in most books. So this may be arguably more for teachers following along. So we use a definite noun phrase, which means, of course, we may have an adjective, we have an article, adjective, and noun, or zero article, adjective, and noun. When we assume that its content is sufficient in the context to identify the referent. In other words, the as a pure marker expresses definiteness, and so it is known as the definite article. Its use is effectively to preempt a which question. If someone says to you, "Where's the key?" they assume that you know what key we're talking about, which key, and it's clear in the context. Note that a genitive determiner confers definiteness, specificity on the noun phrase. So the man's death means the death of the man, one man specifically. Likewise, a man's death means the death of a man, where the could mean any man or one man. Noun phrases like black coffee and close friends have a common noun as head, no determiner, and are basically indefinite. Now we could argue again that black coffee just has a zero article because coffee is non-countable, and we don't need to say a cup of coffee in certain cases. So it could be actually definite. If I say this black coffee, or I'd like some black coffee, we're talking about some that is available. So in other words, other determiners like some would act as the definite, even though some itself is, sort of vague in terms of quantity. The difficulty lies in knowing when to remove the or an. When a determiner is not present, it is silent, which is in linguistics this so-called zero article. And you can check these in my ebook. I have links that support what I'm saying. Sorry if my image is blurred here, but I guess the focus is on the text. So zero article because technically it is there, only not outspoken. I'm using outspoken in a flexible way, right? We understand it in the context. Now that in many languages there are no determiners as such, And so when non-natives speak, they may add them in English, even when there should be a zero article. Therein lies the difficulty. Note that we can't say she came in the third place in the competition. The is silent. She came in third place. Probably because it denotes a position or level, and the same goes for the example, she is in 5th grade in school. It's a position in time, level, location. Though if we did say she is in the 5th grade, we're referring to which specific class and category or stage from a finite number. Actually, English uses articles basically as a kind of rhythmic filler. And this is my argument that I was putting out to AI and not getting a really straightforward answer right away. And then it finally admitted that, well, there are nuances and it's complex and therefore it's flexible. So take the word nature, which is normally non-countable. Right? We will say nature is non-countable. And yet we may find the use of the nature when it's used in the syntax with of. So the nature of reality, of consciousness, the nature of language, and morality, etc. Where do we not use the? So when we make generalizations, I don't think people are inherently greedy. It is the environment that will influence them. I don't particularly like the word people unless you're talking about population. The reason for that is that people is overly used for anything, and it's generally there to try to appeal to others with your opinions about things. So you'll say people this, people that. Well, overly used and redundant in most cases. Back to this, so we don't use the with titles, proper names, and countries. So again, British people love queuing. Maybe it's better to say Brits are accustomed to queuing, or the Brits are accustomed to queuing, to avoid people again. Although people here is okay because we're talking about the population in general. So then you have, this is typical of grammar books, right? You'll find all kinds of tables and lists to use the and where not to use the. And in the end, your head is filled with rules that you seem to sort of have to apparently memorize and rote learn, which is not really true if you understand the underlying function of the. One aspect, though, is, of course, is that groups, right? We have a group of United States, of states that are united, and this group is then the. Another aspect is that the shows prominence, so size and importance, significance. And then, of course, they'll say there's fixed expressions, so you kind of, again, need to memorize them, right? I'm not too sure about that one. I think the cinema and the radio, these are phenomena. And that's why we use the. The internet, right? The internet or the internet. We're going to look at more about pronouncing the as well. So then there's, of course, special cases, or what we call the exceptions, right? And sometimes the exceptions are more important. Where a particular location is involved, the definite article is used. It's a specific location. Now, she was dismissed from the hospital, where normally, if a person is in a hospital as a patient, we would say she is in hospital. She has been hospitalized and she's in the state of being in hospital. So we don't say the, because the would stress the location. So we take it out. There's various ways of looking at it, but if we see it that way, we understand better that it's not about the rule where it should be or not. It's about what the functions as. So the plumber, or a plumber, went to the prison to do maintenance. So he went to the location, the premises. It's clear from the context that the plumber was not put in prison. He was sent there, hopefully just to visit and do his work and fix the plumbing, right? Again, we could question, why is the there? Well, the specific plumbing of that. location. The omission of the in instruction manuals, another reason why learners may get confounded, like, well, if I'm reading instruction manuals most of the time in my job, and there's no the anywhere, why should I put one? It's not there in my language, right? So we can see that here, and then you have the zero article. The underscore shows where there is no article. Why do we not say the dinner? Well, dinner is a time of eating, and so it's not needed. It's not the dinner itself, it's time I ate. But these underlying understandings of the should come from the function of that word. Do I need it or not? And we're going to look at that also when we're talking about the so-called present perfect. We're going to look at why have is used and why we then don't use have. Relevant because have has a function. It's simply existential. But we'll look at that in another video. So moving right along, we have the omission of the when we say, for example, he is lying in bed. So he is in a state of being in bed. He went to bed. In other words, he went to sleep. Put the pillows back on the bed. It's clear that we're talking about the location. Now, with school and other institutions, right, we're talking about levels. He goes to school means he goes to learn from a particular stage in life. And so he is in school. Also explains the preposition there. If he's at school, it's the location. If he's in school, it's a time, it's a phase. Which is also interesting because we're in we're in conversation. Anyhow, so the omission of a determiner and other lexical items in idiomatic expressions would be intentional, as it would serve as a stylistic or rhetorical purpose. In some cases, the omission or insertion of a determiner would serve to be more concise, but also rhythmic, emphatic, or might give an element of irony or other nuance. Consider, the more we quantify, as we're doing here, the more we risk restricting and distorting the free flow of English. So although more is in the comparative and not a superlative there, we still use the. That could be a question, right? Why do we use the with more? Isn't it with the most? Well, even the is not necessary in some cases with superlative. But it is a misconception to say that one, the, need come before a superlative, and two, that the should not be used before a comparative, and such nonsense, generalizations and dilution. And yet, if we say more we quantify, more we risk and omitting the, we would likely be met with disapproval. Thus serves to indicate a specific quantity or degree of quantification that has been previously mentioned or implied. And this is because the refers back to a point in conversation that has just been raised that also involves quantification. So in books like the Murphy, which is the most widespread book probably in the world, you find things like this, right? And I've added the nice green color there to emphasize where the is used. But if you come across rules like this, you'll never really learn it. It's a nice reference, but in speaking in real time, this is not going to happen unless you understand the intrinsic meaning of the. At this point, that the use of the before the name of a river or museum may also have to do with how culturally and historically significant it features in a country, or how prominent is its status, or how vast a landscape is, for example. That certainly is the case for the oceans, right? So the ocean. It's important, therefore, not to focus too much on the rules, but to hear how they resonate and to take a more holistic perspective. So my Insider English book is how we can get into a more holistic approach to language. Take a look at this. Cinema, the cinema. We used to say the dollies. A dolly is actually this, one of those devices which carry the instrument that we wheel around, the film camera, in fact. Some nouns take the determiner the, even when we speak in general about it. So we go to the cinema about once a month, since although the generally refers to specific things, we mean an event taking place at one particular group of theater houses. Again, the group is important here, and the of, right? Group of. So really, when we're using the cinema, we're simplifying again. And this aspect of simplification is really about being concise in our communication. Consider there is a cinema in these parts. We mean a single edifice where cinematography or the art of filmmaking takes place. And film is short for filament, which came from film, meaning fiber, thread, coating. Old English was filmen, which meant membrane. In cinematography, film is the thin, flexible strip of cellulose coated with a photographic emulsion, a series of negative transparencies for projecting onto canvas via projectors. These reels of film collectively were called the cinema. The rolls of film, the reels of film were called the cinema, not the place. You see how language develops. And if we understand a little bit more about that, especially as teachers, we can be more flexible with it and stop with the rules. Consider, I play a musical instrument called the violin. When talking about the collection or series of instruments with which to play music. Of course, we don't need to say I play the guitar in North America. Why is that? Why can I be flexible here and not flexible in other places? Something to ask AI. Movie is short for moving pictures, which is what it was first called. And then the pictures, the dollies, were all plural nouns. But though cinema is a collection, and the should clue us into the plural, in fact, here, is a collective noun. We kept the, and in the USA, and now worldwide, they say the movies. Consider, let's go to the theater and see a play. We're talking about the theater house and a theatrical play, condensed and simplified. Why? It's playing in cinemas. Note, I haven't put the. This is just one of many illustrations of how flexible English is. Okay, finally, now this shouldn't come last, in fact, but because pronunciation tends to be the last thing we talk about, when really communication, verbally especially, is about sound. In order for words to sound more connected, we use two different sounds for pronouncing the. And this is in my book where you have useful things for autonomous learners and maybe also for teachers. And this doesn't appear in most mainstream course books. And if it does, it'd be so-called advanced. But these are things we need to understand, because they're things that we say that learners listen to and don't understand why we say the and the. Well, here we go. And there we go. We've got the audio there, which is something you don't find in books with, for example, irregular verbs. There's never an audio for the irregular verbs, and they're just in alphabetical order, as if you should go and reference, something alphabetically before you can speak. It's nonsense. It's not well thought out. And so this is what I'm trying to put into my work. So take a look at the left column. You can practice saying these together with the sound the. So the joke, the news, the morning, the music, the Republic of China, the blue taxi. Whereas here on the right, The with things like the alphabet, the item, the unit, the evening. Why don't we say the evening? Well, it's just more difficult. The evening, more tongue motion and jaw motion. And so we just say the evening, the oven, not the oven, the oven, the oven, the oven, the United States of America, the USA, the UK, the yellow cab. So now we look at it another way. We can look at my tables this way and that way. So, for example, the blue taxi, the yellow cab, the Republic of China, the USA, the morning, the evening. Okay? So my tables generally work in rows and columns. There's a third use for the, called the emphatic the, used to point to something that is unique. So the queen, the late queen. So on the throne is in power. The throne is the king's chair. Thanks for watching. Hope you've learned some things from that, and I hope if you're teaching English, we'll pass this on. Change the approach, please. How to teach. Thanks.